The streets were not safe. In 215 AD, Alexandria, once a haven of learning, it boiled with violence. Pagan mobs stormed the city, furious at the Christian presence that had quietly taken root. They smashed homes, they burned meeting places, and they dragged believers into the open. It wasn't just persecution, it was a purge. But while others fled, one man refused to vanish. His name was Origen. He had every reason to disappear. Years earlier, his father had been executed for being a Christian. He was still a young man, brilliant, intense, unmarried, and now the same fury that killed his father had returned. His students, they scattered. His reputation, though, it made him a target. Yet he stayed, not to fight, but to teach. Hidden in the shadows of a burning city, Origen opened the scriptures, and he trained disciples in secret. He asked the kinds of questions most Christians don't dare ask. He believed that truth, bold, risky, raw truth, was worth more than safety. But truth wasn't the only thing he wrestled with. Where does reason end and revelation begin? How far can speculation go before it becomes heresy? And in a world on fire, could theology survive the smoke? From the That's Jesus channel, welcome to Coach, where we trace church origins and church history. I'm Bob Balch. On Mondays, we stay between 0 and 500 AD, and today we travel to one of the most volatile cities in the Roman Empire, Alexandria. A city of scholars and soldiers, of scrolls and swords, of philosophy, politics, and violent religion. In 215 AD, Alexandria erupted. Pagan mobs targeted Christians in a wave of hostility that left bodies in the streets and homes in ashes. The Roman authorities did little to intervene. For many believers, this was a moment to disappear, to hide, to survive. But one Christian teacher did the opposite. Origen was no stranger to persecution. He had already seen his father martyred. He knew the cost of staying visible, but he believed Christian thought should not retreat when threatened. It should deepen. So in the middle of the chaos, he thought, well, I should teach. So he debated, and he wrote. This is the story of Origen's courage in the shadows and the intellectual movement he helped ignite. It's about theology under pressure, doctrine under fire, and a man who dared to think out loud. And when you're thinking out loud, sometimes that thinking can get you killed. Origen's world had already cracked once. He was just a teenager when his father, Leonidas, was arrested for being a Christian. Rome had tightened its grip on the region, and the Emperor Septimius Severus had outlawed conversions. Leonidas was taken, imprisoned, and ultimately he was executed. Young Origen wanted to follow him into martyrdom, but his mother stopped him, not by persuasion, but by hiding his clothes so he couldn't leave the house. And it worked. But he didn't change his mind. The faith that could make a father choose death over denial, Origen wanted to understand it. Not just emotionally, but intellectually, spiritually, cosmically. And in a city like Alexandria, he had the tools. The famed Alexandrian school was a unique blend of Hebrew thought, Hellenistic philosophy, and Christian devotion. It wasn't a formal institution. It was more like a network of seekers, scholars, scribes. Origen stood out, though. He mastered Hebrew, he studied Greek philosophy, and he threw himself into the scriptures. He was particularly fascinated by texts that puzzled others, passages that didn't make sense unless you believed there was something beneath the surface. He began to teach that the Bible wasn't just literal, it was layered. It spoke in symbols, it pointed to spiritual realities beneath the physical stories. One of his students recorded that Origen believed the deeper meaning of Scripture was like the soul within a body. It was hidden, essential, and alive. But Origen's teaching wasn't just about insight, it was also about discipline. He fasted frequently, he studied constantly, and he lived simply. He believed the mind couldn't grasp divine truth if the body was in control, and he demanded that his students pursue holiness with the same intensity that they brought to their books. Origen's writings exploded in volume: commentaries, homilies, letters. His work on the book of John would become one of the earliest and most ambitious Christian commentaries ever written. But as Origen's influence grew, so did the opposition. His allegorical method troubled more literal-minded believers. His speculative theology raised eyebrows, especially among the bishops. And even his discipline was questioned. Some believed it went too far. Still, the heart of Origen's vision was simple. Christianity should never be shallow. It should dare to ask. It should dare to wrestle. And it should dare to seek. But not everyone agreed. And not everyone thought he should keep on teaching. As Alexandria descended into chaos, Origen kept teaching. He didn't have a pulpit, he didn't have protection, but what he did have was a scroll, a candle, and a gathering of students willing to risk their lives to learn. His lectures were often held in secret, sometimes in homes, sometimes in borrowed rooms, but always with the possibility of discovery. And what he taught wasn't safe either. Origen believed in divine order, but not the kind that the empire enforced. He taught that all creation was infused with a purpose, that every story in the Bible had meaning on multiple levels, that Scripture didn't just tell you what happened, it invited you into what was still happening. He described the Garden of Eden not merely as a historical place, but as a picture of the soul's journey. He read the Exodus not just as deliverance from Pharaoh, but as the Spirit's escape from sin. For Origen, the Bible wasn't bound to the past. It was a living book. But as that approach sparked controversy, other things happened as well. Bishop Demetrius of Alexandria, Origen's ecclesiastical superior, he grew increasingly uneasy with the younger man's popularity. Origen had begun teaching outside of Alexandria, sometimes without the explicit permission of his superiors. His writings circulated across regions, and he was invited to preach in Caesarea, where he delivered messages that sounded more like Plato than Peter. One of his listeners reportedly said that it felt like hearing the gospel through the lens of Socrates. And then came the act that would trigger a breaking point. Origen was ordained as a presbyter in Caesarea without Demetrius's consent. Now, that was more than a breach of protocol. In the eyes of many, it was an act of rebellion. Demetrius responded harshly. He convened a synod to censure Origen. The result was formal condemnation and expulsion from Alexandria's church leadership. Origen left the city, wounded but unbroken. He relocated to Caesarea permanently, and there, under pressure and exile, his most prolific period began. He compiled a book, a massive comparative study of the Old Testament in 6 different versions. He debated heretics and philosophers, he mentored new leaders, and he wrote on First Principles, which was a bold attempt to explain Christian doctrine systematically. In it, Origen ventured into territory that made his superiors very nervous. He speculated about the preexistence of souls. He proposed that all beings, perhaps even the devil, might eventually be restored to God. These were not formal teachings. They were theological thought experiments, but they raised a lot of red flags, and they would haunt his legacy for centuries. Even so, his writing burned with urgency, not because he wanted controversy, but because he believed the church needed depth. It needed courage. It needed clarity, even if it came at a cost. The fire that consumed Alexandria had changed Origen, but it didn't stop him. In Caesarea, he became something the early church had never quite seen before, a theologian in exile, shaping doctrine from the margins. He no longer held an official position in Alexandria. His authority came not from ordination, but came from his ideas, his dangerous, luminous ideas. Origen's most pivotal moment came not from a debate, but from a decision. After years of teaching, writing, and defending the faith, he was once again faced with the threat that had defined his childhood: persecution. Under the Emperor Decius, Christianity was outlawed once more. Bishops were imprisoned, believers were tortured, and Origen, now in his 60s, was arrested. The prison guards, they showed no mercy. He was chained, he was beaten, he was stretched on the rack, and he was starved. But like his father before him, Origen refused to renounce his faith. He survived the torture, but barely. He was released when the persecution eased, but his health was broken. A few years later, he died from those same injuries. But his death wasn't what defined him. His faith under pressure wasn't a final act. It was a culmination. This man, whose speculations sometimes troubled the church, had embodied something that no one could deny: endurance, boldness, loyalty to Jesus even when it hurt. And in that moment, even his critics had to pause. One bishop who had once opposed him reportedly said that Origen's resilience proved his heart was full of the Spirit. It's easy to critique someone's theology in a classroom, but it is harder to do it when they're bleeding in a cell. Origen's ideas would continue to stir controversy long after his death. Centuries later, some of his ideas would be condemned at councils. His views on preexistence and his view on a final reconciliation would be rejected. And yet, his commitment to Scripture, his call to holiness, his courage under fire, those became pillars for generations of Christian thinkers. He didn't write for applause, he wrote for truth. And even when that truth was unclear and unfinished or unsettling, he wrote anyway. And that makes Origen a paradox. He's not remembered as a saint by everyone. He is not canonized, and he's not uncontroversial either. But he is remembered. And for thinking when others silenced their minds, he became something of a legend. For staying when others fled, for choosing truth over safety again and again. Now we seek comfort. Origen sought clarity. Could we endure the fire and still hold our convictions? Could we let go of certainty and still cling to Jesus? Origen's legacy is as layered as the scriptures that he loved. Some remember him as a mystic. Others remember him as a scholar. Still others remember him as a dangerous thinker who wandered too far from the path. But no one could ignore his impact. He made allegory central to Christian interpretation, not by inventing it, but by refining it. Before Origen, many Christians read scriptures literally, or at the most, typologically. But Origen insisted that the Bible had multiple dimensions. His approach laid the groundwork for later giants like Gregory of Nyssa and Augustine. He also helped frame early Christian theology as a serious intellectual pursuit. In an age when some believers preferred to keep the faith simple and undisturbed, Origen opened the floodgates of inquiry. He argued that loving God with all your mind wasn't optional, it was essential. His hexapla was a staggering achievement of linguistic and textual analysis, and his On First Principles became the first attempt at a systematic theology in Christian history. But his influence was not just academic. His personal discipline inspired the monastic movement. His devotion to Scripture shaped the liturgy. His courage under persecution reminded believers that intellectual passion did not make one weak, it made one bold. Modern Christians may not agree with all of his conclusions, but we still wrestle with the same questions that he did. How do we read Scripture deeply? Where does speculation help, or harm our faith? How far can we stretch our minds before our hearts lose their grip? Origen never claimed to have all the answers. What he offered was the example of a man willing to ask, willing to seek, and willing to suffer for the truth he saw. And in a world still torn by conflict, confusion, and compromise, that example matters. In a city on fire, Origen chose not to run. He could have lived quietly, safely, somewhere far from the mobs and heresy trials, but instead he stood his ground, not with fists, but with scrolls, not in protest, but in prayer. He taught truth when truth was dangerous. He asked questions when silence was safer, and when persecution came again in his old age, he answered with scars, not bitterness. What made him stay? Origen believed that faith wasn't just something to feel. It was something to pursue. It was something to refine. It was something to challenge. And even when it offended, even when it confused, even when it cost, it was worth it. His legacy reminds us, Christian courage isn't just about dying for the faith. Sometimes it's about living it out under pressure, with discipline and humility, while knowing others may never fully understand you. Now, we chase clarity. Origen chased Christ. He didn't always land where the church would later affirm, but he never stopped running after the truth. What about us? Do we dare to read Scripture more deeply? Do we dare to wrestle with doctrine, not just to be clever, but to be faithful? And do we love God with all of our mind, or just with the parts that feel safe? If this story of Origen challenged or encouraged you, would you consider sharing this episode with a friend? You never know who might need to hear it. And it would really be appreciated if you went above and beyond by reviewing this podcast in your podcast app. And don't forget to follow Coach for more episodes every week. Make sure you check out the show notes for sources that were used in the creation of this episode. And if you look closely, you'll probably find some contrary opinions in there as well. And there's some Amazon links so you can get them for your own library while giving me a little bit of a kickback. As an Amazon associate, I earn from qualifying purchases, and who knows, I could earn up to $1 this year. You never know what we'll cover next on Coach. Every episode dives deep into a different corner of church history, but on Mondays, we stay between 0 and 500 AD. And if you'd rather watch me tell these stories instead of just listening to them, you can find this episode and every Coach episode on YouTube at the That's Jesus channel. Thanks for listening to Coach, Church Origins, and Church History. I'm Bob Balch with the That's Jesus channel. Have a great day and be blessed.